Hey guys, it's Kiara, and in this lesson we'll be talking about everything that we didn't cover in previous chapters. So in this case, we'll be talking about artboards, non-linear workflows, and linear workflows. Really to help you set up a very efficient workflow, so you can get from the sketching phase of the logo all the way to actually finishing the logo much faster. And even organizing your files in a way just to keep it clean and again, very efficient. So let's dive right in through the artboards. So when you went to File, New, and you got to create a new document, you actually got to choose the size of the artboard. So in this case, we had a 1000 pixels by 1000 pixels. But in many cases, we actually want to expand that artboard so we can actually include more variations of a logo or just change it to fit the size of a business card. So in this case, you can just go over to the artboard tool, Shift C, and we can stretch it out. We can stretch it out just by going to the very corners of it. And we can actually change the size of it after we already created the document and set the height and width. So in this case, this became our new artboard. So if we go to File and Save, it's going to save this entire document as is. We don't have to worry about if anything is going to get misplaced or rearranged. As an Illustrator file, it's always going to open like this. And if we go to File for Save for Web, it's going to save this entire artboard as is because we already set the dimensions of it. But in many cases, we actually want to have a separate artboard for the logo, a separate artboard for the business cards, a separate logo for the letterhead, and it's all going to be in different sizes when we're actually saving it out as PNGs. So it's useful to have different documents with different widths and heights so we can actually rearrange the logo and the graphics and the text to fit accordingly. But having multiple documents, you have to tab in, tab out, switch tabs, have 5 different Illustrator files just for one client, can get kind of messy. So in this case, we have the artboard tool. So again, we can go to the artboard tool and we can actually create new documents within the existing document. So in this case, we're just creating multiple artboards. So I can create another artboard. Let's just do this business card size. And I'm just going to bring in this graphic as an example of what we would do as a business card. And I'm just going to add the colors on it. Pretty cool. So now we have one artboard, let's say for the style guide, and one artboard just for the business card. And we can see that, again, there's a visible difference. But the advantage of actually doing this is that we can actually save them out at different times, and we can actually save out the entire thing as a PNG, as opposed to going to each separate document and saving it out as a PNG, because it's a much faster process. So if you click, for example, on this artboard, and you go to File, Save for Web, it's going to save only this artboard. And the exact same thing will apply if you click on this artboard, just tap it once, File, Save for Web, and it's going to save out this artboard separately. We don't have to create multiple documents just to do this. And we can save out the entire thing all at once just by going to Export. We can do PNG. We can select Use Artboards, All. We can even select the range if we wanted to. We can export this, let's say, to desktop. And then if we go to our desktop, after we wrote the PNG file, we can see that Illustrator created 2 files, PNG format, and is just what we wanted. So again, it's a big time saver just because if you're creating multiple business cards for different people and you have letterheads and you have all these different types of logo variations for smaller sizes, for larger sizes, black and white, text for different people, this is much faster to work with just because you don't have to create and keep hold of multiple documents, just because tabbing in and out, you're going to get confused really fast. And in this case, we can actually see the befores and after of the logo, and we can all keep it on one window. So it's very comfortable to work with. So let's just get rid of the artboard, because in this case, we don't want this logo variation. And now this will never get saved as a PNG, but it will remain in the Illustrator file. And we can just delete it. And we're good to start anew. So now let's briefly touch over gradients. Now in logos, you often want to keep away from gradients just because they're much harder to print and there might be inaccuracies most of the time if you're working with a poor printer or if you're only working with 2 colors, and gradients of course are going to produce multiple colors. Just if we want to do some translucency or just some quick shine on a logo, because I don't know what you would be creating, but it's helpful to know. So gradients work in the same way that you need to create 2 swatches, the beginning of the gradient and the end of the gradient. You can apply it to any existing shape. And we have this middle button right below the fill, just to signify when we are creating a gradient. And if you're not creating a gradient, it would be of course on the fill option. So let's just say we want to take this blue and we want to add it to our swatch. So we're going to do new swatch. And then we want to take this existing blue and just, give it a darker color. Something like this would work. Okay. And we do, again, new swatch. So we have the two swatches that we're going to use from the beginning and end. So now we want to go over to this black and white little icon, which signifies gradient. We're going to click it. And our logo is going to become black and white as a gradient. But we want to replace this one node and this other node with the colors that we created. So I'm just going to open up this little swatches panel, and I'm just going to drag it in. And I'm going to do the exact same thing for the other swatch. Perfect. But we don't really want the white and black, so we can just click and you just drag it below. Click and drag below. Whoops. Selected the wrong gradient. Click and drag below. Click and drag below. And then you can click, and instead of dragging below, just drag it all the way to the end and all the way to the end. And we just created a gradient in 2 simple steps. But there's not always the case that we want the gradient to start and end from here. Sometimes we want to go from a diagonal, or we want it to start and end faster. So we can click G on our keyboard, and we're going to get this line. And this line signifies where our gradient starts and where our gradient ends. We can actually take and drag it wherever we want. And the gradient is going to change live. And we can make this a bit shorter, make the conversion much faster, or even take it and we can rotate it. And it's very easy to play with, and if you're creating a logo, this might be a cool effect if you're just creating some kind of quick shine and the logo isn't going to get printed. This is actually a really cool effect. And then once you create this gradient and you're no longer going to be touching this, you can go to, again, the swatches panel, create a new swatch. This is going to be a gradient. And then if you go over to another box, you can apply the same gradient, and you can do the exact same changes just by clicking G and dragging it in, dragging it out, or even changing the rotation. And another quick tip, you don't exactly have to do linear all the time. You can do radial as well, and it'll just go from the center and spin out. And the exact same colors apply. So cool, gradients are pretty cool to work with. So now on to the bulk of this lesson, and that's linear workflow versus non-linear workflow. And usually, when you're designing, you won't even notice which workflow you're using until you get to the point where you want to go back 20 steps, and either you can or you can't. So let's just demo this really quickly, just so we understand the difference, and then we'll use it in practical situations, just so you can always keep an eye out on how you're using it, and always making sure that you're staying non-linear as long as possible. So, linear. So we have a cube, we apply a stroke to the cube, but we can always go back to the stroke and remove it, and we go back to the previous step. But then let's say we want to take the cube and we want to change some of its size, and we just want to start playing around with it. So in this case, we take the cube, we expand it, we change it up as much as we want, but 20 steps later, we realize that we don't exactly want the cube's stroke to be, 20 points. So we go back, but we realize the cube has no stroke. And that's because if we take the cube and just drag it down, we see that the cube and the stroke are completely separate things. And even if we click the stroke, we can't even change it because it's just considered to be one big object. And if we want to change the size of it, maybe we can try just to click the actual stroke and shrink it down. But that won't work because it's already on top of each other. We can go back, we can send it to back. It's already not looking that great just because the cube now became actually larger than the original size. And we see that we're running into a lot of issues just because we can't go back a step. And if you're just, a step forward and you want to go a step back, you can always do Command Z and you can go back in history. But imagine you're 2 hours into a logo and the client says that he wants all the strokes to be 2 points thinner. You might have to actually go back and manually do it, or just redo the entire logo, just because it's getting to such a complicated point that redoing it or even changing it manually might not even be accurate. And you're basically out of 3 hours just because you have to redo the entire process, just because you didn't keep it non-linear. But in this case, we have a green cube, we have a green cube with a stroke, and we keep the green cube with the stroke, but we can actually go back to the stroke properties and change it to be outer or inner. And even if we go 40 steps into the future, we can still change this property without having to redo the entire thing. We can go and change the stroke width to be thinner. We can take a singular point and we can stretch it out. And that stroke will still apply to that point. And again, you're saving a lot of time just because you can always go back 50 steps into the future, change a property, and then in the present day or the present time, you're still keeping that stroke how you changed it 50 steps earlier. So you're not limited to go step by step by step, knowing that you can never go back. With a non-linear workflow, if you change something, you can always go back and rechange it. And that's a really healthy practice to adopt. So keep in mind when you're doing this, just so you can avoid trouble in the future. If you know that's some kind of property that you're changing, a color or the width of a triangle or the roundness of a triangle, that it doesn't get rasterized or expanded to the point where you can no longer change it. So let's actually go over to this little blend property we have and see this in motion. Right now we have a blend property just applied to these two cubes, and it's creating multiple cubes in between. I think we have like 5 created in between that just create a color closer and closer and closer to the other cube. So this is creating this gradient, but instead of having a color just go through a rectangle, these are individual shapes. But watch what happens when I take this cube and I drag it a bit up. You can see that the cubes in between adjust automatically, and we don't have to go to each cube, go to our number pad and just click 1 so it goes up a bit higher, and just do that for every single cube. Here it's all done for us. So I can take this cube, drag it to the right, we see that all the cubes expand, you can drag it even lower, just so you can see that these are all individual cubes, and that this is all happening however we change it to. And we don't have to go back and do this all manually. Illustrator is keeping in mind that this is non-linear, and it's just going to change however we want. And it even applies to color properties. If we want it to be, let's say, blue, the transition is going to change automatically. And this is a really good example of a non-linear workflow. But let's say, let's just go back a few steps. Let's say that we want to change this cube's color, but instead of doing it through this process, we want to do it manually. So we click on this cube, or this entire object, and we do Object, Expand. And every single one of these things turn it to its own domain. And we can click this cube, turn it a bit darker, just for our liking. We say okay. We do the logo, we go 40 minutes later, and we realize that this color down here should be, let's say, blue. If we change this to blue, nothing's gonna change. And that's a big problem on a larger scale, because you'd have to go back and redo every single one of these processes. And we can actually recreate this again just by going to these two cubes, selecting them, going to blend, blend options, specified steps, let's just say 3, and then object, blend, make. And then in this case again, we stay non-linear. And if we change this little guy to blue, everything changes for us. So it's a good method to practice, and we can see how quickly we could have saved time if we just did it this way, as opposed to going to each one of these cubes, choosing a blue color, and going slightly lighter, hoping that it might just reach the yellow and be accurate, which in most cases it probably won't be. So keep this in mind. It's a healthy practice to adopt. And as a quick tip as well, if you are going to linear, you may as well just make a duplicate copy of whatever you have at that point that's non-linear. So I can have this logo, for example, Command C. I can just create a quick new artboard, and I can just paste it in here. So if I ever want to go back in the past and just see for reference, or even just go back and, nab a little part of this, we can always go back and do that, just because we have a copy of the logo. That way, if we mess this logo up to a point where we want to go back and we can't, we always have a version of it that is changeable and pretty easy to work with. So keep that in mind and utilize the artboards for the better. So now let's actually talk about fonts. Now we'll be talking about actually pairing a good font with your logo later on, but before that we actually need to know how to incorporate a font into Illustrator, because there are a lot of fonts that I may have that you may not have, and vice versa. And that's because Illustrator doesn't exactly come with pre-packaged fonts, it just uses whatever fonts you have in your system. And to get a font into Illustrator, you need to download a font into your system, and then Illustrator will read it from the system. And there's lots of free fonts to choose from. In fact, there's a lot of great ones out there as well. There are some paid ones and then we'll see how we can actually throw it into Illustrator and what we can do with it. So, my favorite site to begin with, to get any font, just to start off with, is the font. Whether you want to test some scripts, some sans serif, some serifs, this is a great place to get a starting point and a feel for what might look really good with your logo. So it's called the font. I'll link it down below. And we can just go to top fonts. And we can just scroll through to see what looks good. Doesn't look so good. Like this York white letter might not look too great with the logo. But something like lemon milk might. So again, take some research to find what you might like and what you might not like. We can go through Bebas, Luna, Keep Calm, Blacklisted. And there's lots to choose from. I'm starting to like these type of fonts, so I can always go to themes and then select something from that particular theme. So we can go like sans serif, and we get lots more from the same category. So let's say like Roboto, you can download it. Then all you have to do is insert it into your system. On Windows, you're just gonna search for fonts and you're gonna throw it in there. On a Mac, you're just gonna search for font book. This should pop up. You're gonna unzip that file, it should automatically open. And you're just gonna drag all the TTFs and any OTFs just into this folder. Should do it automatically. And it does, which is perfect. So I'm gonna close all that down. Illustrator is gonna load up. And if we click T on our keyboard, we'll have the typography tool pop up over here, the type tool. We can click anywhere, and let's just type out logo core. And we're gonna make this a bit larger. So that was the default font that we previously used. So I'm just gonna click T, Command A, and in the character menu, I'm just gonna type in Roboto. And we have it right here. So let's actually try Roboto Bold, and that looks wonderful. But in this case, we actually want to make the letters a bit closer to each other. They're a bit spaced out. So all the options, when we actually click on the logo, or sorry, my bad, the actual type, we can get all the options from here. And opacity just decreases the transparency. In this case, the character menu will actually start playing with the actual individual characters. So in this case, we want to set the tracking, and we don't want the tracking to be 50, which is just the space between the letters. We want to bring it into somewhat of a minus 35. And that looks really good. And we can increase it up. We can select the type tool again, highlight the logo part. Let's make it bold, which it already was. That means we have to take the core and let's make it light. And there we go. We have logo core. That actually looks really good already. So right now, again, like we talked about before, we are in the non-linear workflow because we can go back and change it all to be bold, change the size of it, change the actual type to logo face or logo time, but in this case, logo core, and it'll change on the go. But if we go to the actual logo and we do edit, or sorry, my bad, object, expand, and we expand the object and we expand the fill, then we can no longer go back and actually type anything out because this entire type and these entire letters just got turned into actual objects, something that you would be creating with a pen tool. And if you click on here, you see that the O is created out of these points, and same goes with the L and the G. So the disadvantage of doing this is that you can't go back and retype something, but in this case, you can actually go into each letter. We can take the L, for example, and just really cut it short. And now we have the modified L. We can bring it in. And there we go. We have logo core with a different L that we just created. We can do the exact same thing for the G. Let's say we don't like how the G looks here. Then we can bring it all the way in. And we can even round off the corners. So we have complete control over how each character looks and even the positions. And yeah, you have much more control, but at the same time, you can't go back and change what you actually expanded. But you can, of course, go back and just make it a different color. It's like a very dark blue. And the changes will remain the same. So that's actually how you bring in a font. And there's also fonts on the font, but there's also some that you can buy on the creative market. And the advantage of doing this is that sometimes the fonts are better developed. They're more unique, so you won't even find them across other logos that already use them. And you also get commercial licenses, because with some of these logos on the font, let's just see if this one has it. No, this one doesn't have it. But in some cases, they are meant for only personal use. So they're fine if you're doing a poster for yourself, or you're just trying out a logo for yourself. But if you're selling this to a commercial client with like a big budget, then you can't take some of these fonts and sell them to them, because you can only use them for personal use. While in the creative market, let's say you buy Hello Sunshine for $15, you own Hello Sunshine and you can use it for commercial purposes. Which, again, you can't do with some fonts that are given out for free on Behance, Dafont, etc. And there is one more great tool that I use when I'm actually creating the logos. It's called WordMarket. And what it does is that it loads up all the fonts that you already have in your system and just previews whatever word you type in here. So it saves you the time on Illustrator, because in Illustrator, let's just type out logo Corrigan. On Illustrator, if you want to scroll through different font choices, you have to click on the logo. You get to choose one. You see that you don't like it, you have to choose another one. And that's how you would cycle through all these different logos. But WordMarket, you can just type in logo core. And it's going to give you all the samples of logo core with all the fonts that you already have installed. So even Fat Frank looks really cool. We see that it's Fat Frank. We go back into here. We choose Fat Frank, free, and boom. We just change the character kerning to, let's say, 20. And that's it. So I'm just going to go back. I'm going to delete this. And I think I'm just going to leave this as a demo, just so we see that we can't exactly change the type on it anymore. Bring it in just a bit. And we're good. Save it out. Now let's fuse what we know about fonts and fuse that knowledge with the non-linear workflow idea. So here I have an example that I made. It's a graphic style. And if you notice that we're not exactly using different layers and different shapes to create this core. In fact, it's all done procedurally. If I type in logo, it'll change right on the fly into logo using the exact same style that we defined. And again, this is really useful just because we don't have to recreate this orange drop shadow for each individual character every time we decide to type out a new letter. Illustrator just does it for us. And it's a big time saver to do this, because even if we want to go 2 years in the future and we want to create a new set of styles and a new set of text for a client using this exact same palette of ideas, then we can just type out a new word and Illustrator will automatically convert it to this graphic style. But if we want to object, expand appearance, then we could no longer do that, because this entire object would just be a series of points and shapes. So we're going to avoid doing that, and we're just going to go back. So with this core idea, we're going to try to recreate this by ourselves just from scratch using the appearance panel. And the appearance panel is just something that controls the fill and stroke, but you can actually stack them like layers. So you can have more than one fill and more than one stroke. So I'm going to start off just by locking all these layers, just so we don't get the guidelines. I'm going to grab my type tool, and I'm going to type in core. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm actually going to change the font to match the one above. I'm going to do Bubble Boy, and that should work. I'm going to try to keep this as non-linear as possible. So we have core. So now we're going to try to match this to this just by starting off with the fill. So we're going to go to Window, grab the appearance dock, and we're just going to make it a bit larger. So now the first thing we have to do is match as gradient. So we have something going from yellow to an orange. So down here, we're going to create a new fill. This fill is going to be a gradient. And in this case, we're going to click G. And we're going to make sure that it goes from yellow to orange top to bottom, as opposed to going left to right. So something like this should work. We're going to have to flip it. So the other way around. Top to bottom, and that looks pretty good. Except the orange looks a bit too strong, so I'm just going to drag it down. Make this a bit larger, and we have that nice gradient effect. Perfect. So now the next thing that we have to do is add that little stroke, but it goes from white to yellow, so we have to keep that in mind. So we're going to go to add new fill. Even though it is a stroke, we're going to utilize the fill option in this case. So it has to be right below. And we have to apply an effect to it so it kind of increases on the borders, so it creates a stroke effect without actually using the stroke. So I'm just going to go to the effects, and I'm going to go into Pathfinder. It's not going to be there. Stylize. We don't see anything about expanding a path. And in the path option, we have something called offset path. And if we preview it, we can see that a larger offset just kind of creates a stroke effect around the actual type. But we don't want it to be too bubbly. That's a play on the actual font name. But something about 2 points. I think 2 points will look good. We're going to click OK. And then we're going to have to change the actual gradient to be kind of yellowish. And we're going to have to do the exact same thing just by clicking G on our keyboard and making sure that the fill kind of starts off very whitish and then just dims into yellow. And this should look pretty good. So now, using the same idea, we're going to do the exact same thing, make a new fill, drag it all the way down, and we kind of want to make it orangey. We won't see anything, but in this case, we want to do the exact same offset path. So path, offset path, we're going to do 2, and then we need to do another transformation. It'll be in the transformation, and we're going to do transform. We're going to click preview again. And we're going to want to move it down to create that drop shadow illusion. We want it to be a drop shadow across the first fill and the second fill, which is why we did that offset path again. So we want to move it vertically. And we're actually going to have to redo that quickly. And here's actually why. When we did the actual fill part, we were just developing the graphic style just in general, because we off-clicked on the actual core. But when we're actually doing this and we want to see the changes, you have to make sure that you don't off-click on the actual text part. Otherwise, you're just creating a graphic style in general as opposed to applying it directly onto the typeface. So I'm just going to quickly do that, just that I realized my own error right there. So I'm just going to do transform. Nope, not my bad. Actually, I have to do a new fill. So I'm just going to drag that all the way below. This fill is going to have a reddish color or even an orange. Same steps as before, offset path, 2 points. And then distort and transform. Transform. Preview. And we're going to move it vertically. And that should work. Okay. So now after this, we actually see that there's a drop shadow. But in this case, on the fake drop shadow that we created, we're going to apply a drop shadow effect. So under stylize, drop shadow, preview, and your computer might get a bit slow here, but as long as you don't change too many options, nothing should crash. We want a 0x offset because we don't want to move it left or right. And then for the Y offset, we're just going to bring it in a bit and change the blur to around 3. And we're going to make it a dark blue. Perfect, okay. And now after all this, we're going to create a general stroke to go around the entire object. So instead of clicking this fill option, we're going to click the stroke option. Drag it all the way below. Even though my computer is getting a bit slow now with the drop shadow effect applied. And for the stroke, I'm just going to increase this value. Change it to a darkest blue. And we're going to do a transform again. Preview. And just move it down just a bit. Perfecto. And the only thing that we're missing now is that on this copy, we have a little white outline going on the bottom. And that shouldn't be too much of a problem. It just has to be right above the actual current fill that we have. And it should be right above the stroke. So I'm just going to create a new fill. We're going to make it white. If we drag it right here, we see that we have no changes. Oh, my bad. Again, we off-clicked the logo, so we have to do that little part again. New fill. Let's make it white. Let's do a slight transform. So distort and transform, transform. Again, let's bring it up just a bit vertically. We have to make sure that we preview what we're doing. So about -1 should create the effect. And let's just drag it below the stroke. See that there are no changes. Drag it below the fill. And see that we have this slight little white outline starting to pop up. And it looks great. And we pretty much mimicked it to the point that we want, except I still don't like that there's a little hole here. And that just means we have to increase the stroke just a bit more. We're just going to do 34 points, 35, 36, 36. Looks good. And even this should kind of go away at this point. So let's do 37, 38. All right, 38 looks good. And that's that. Now the only thing we have to do from this point is actually put it on this little curve. And I didn't do the original idea of typing it on a path, because in that case all our letters would be slanted upwards, but we want to kind of slant them to the right just a bit. And I'm going to introduce the warp effect just after I dim the color here. Perfect. So because we are in a non-linear workflow as per usual, we can actually utilize the options to actually modify it and warp it and distort it, because we can still go back and change it at a later point. So I'm going to click the core, going to go to effect, warp, and we can start playing around with the options. And in this case, I don't want to do an arc, but I want to do a rise. I want to kind of ease in the effect. I'm even going to play around with a different type of style. And that looks pretty good. And now we have core written out in a slightly different way, but we see that we have the effect applied, and now we have to keep in mind that now we have a whole graphic style applied, and then we have the warp rise added as well. And no matter what we change it to, logo or core like we had before, or even the word happy, even doesn't matter what length it is, it's always going to apply this same exact graphic style. And it's important to do this because it really teaches you how to use this non-linear workflow. Because you can imagine that doing this manually, taking the core, expanding it, doing the little numpad thing and bringing it 10 points down, changing the color of it, and then doing the exact same thing for the fill, could take you a couple of years to finish, to be completely honest. So remember, use the non-linear workflow, abuse and abuse, and you'll be able to create your logos much faster. And if the client ever says that he wants to change everything to a light pink hue or a light blue hue, you can do that within a heartbeat. And before you actually jump into creating a logo, let's actually go over 2 quick tips, just so you're prepared to actually overcome any issues that you might have that I didn't discuss previously. So, if your logo utilizes a lot of strokes and a lot of effects, then if you're trying to scale your logo up or down, you want to make sure that that stroke retains proportionally to the actual scale of the object. So if your logo was designed on 1000 pixels by 1000 pixels and you use a 22 stroke, then you want that stroke to scale if you suddenly scale down your entire logo. So let's say we take this rectangle and it uses a 10-point stroke. If we scale this rectangle up, the stroke is going to scale with it. And that's because in Illustrator I have the preference turned on for scale strokes and effects. But if we turn this off, then if we take this rectangle that has let's just round it to 40-point stroke, and we scale all the way down, then it will retain its stroke size and it's not going to scale down proportionally. So keep this in mind when you're creating a logo, just because you might run into this issue, and it's important to set your preferences right. And one more thing, when you're developing any type of logo, it's important to have guides set up. So if you're developing a logo that uses a lot of verticality and you want to make sure that everything's properly aligned, you can always go to View, Guides, make sure that your guides aren't hidden, Rulers, enable rulers, and then just drag out rulers from here. And we can test if everything is proportionally lining up. But in some cases, you can actually have rulers going on a diagonal, so you have to make one as a guide. So in this case, we can just go to the pen tool, and let's just draw out a line. Let's kind of match it up on this ramp that we have going on. I'm actually going to give it a stroke just for now, just so I see what I'm changing. Let's just bring it up right here and bring this just a bit down. And then we can right click and do make guides. And now that we see our logo is on a separate guide, that's a bit slanted. So use that to your advantage and to proof your logo so your client doesn't see any mistakes 2 years into the future and you avoid an embarrassing email. So you should be good to go, and I'll see you in the next lesson.